Good morning. It's good to be back here, and having another opportunity to continue our study on 1 and 2 Thessalonians. In the series, this is the part 4 of the series, and in this series so far, we have seen in 3 parts that we have looked at, we have seen that the church in Thessalonica was set up according to God's will and God's plan, and through a series of events orchestrated by God. Right? You remember Paul's plan to go to Asia, and the Holy Spirit stopping him, and then the Macedonian call, and that the way God orchestrated that he lands up there and sets up the church in about 3 to 4 weeks' time, right? And this church became a model church, and we are looking into some of the factors that contributed to it becoming a model church, right? And one of the reasons that we saw was that for them to become a model church was that they had great hope and they had great anticipation about the second coming of Jesus. So we looked at the happenings that should happen around the second coming of Jesus and a better understanding of his second coming. And of course, in the last part, the third part 3, we saw that the Thessalonian church could be called as a true church in preparation for second coming. So all that we are looking at is what do we need to do to prepare for his second coming, as Paul asked the Thessalonian church. And we saw that one of the things that we need to do is to be looking at the true church, right? So that is what we have seen, and then we saw that the true church has got 4 pillars, and the first pillar is true transformation. The second pillar is true ministry. The third one is true fellowship, and the fourth one is true evangelism. And we saw about true transformation in the last part. We saw the true transformation in the last part, right? There were 4 pillars, and so we are going to look at the second pillar of the true church, and and then the second pillar is the second pillar is actually built on these 3 core principles of Christianity, right? I'm sure all of us know this. These are the core principles around which Christianity is built, right? Hope, faith, and love, or love, faith, hope, and love, in whichever order you put it, right? So let us see how Paul starts the letter to the Thessalonians, right? So if you could go to 1 Thessalonians 1:3, you could go to 1 Thessalonians 1:3, you would see that Paul says, I am doing this, I'm writing to you, remembering without ceasing your work of faith, labor of love, and the patience of hope, right? You see that? Faith, hope, and love coming there, right? Remembering without ceasing your work of faith, labor of love, and the patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ, in the sight of our God and Father. Now, later on, of course, in 1 Thessalonians 5:8, he goes on to use this faith, hope, and love as shields to protect them from the evil one. So he says in 1 Thessalonians 5:8, but let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation, right? So you will see this recurring theme of faith, hope, and love coming in this letter. And what we can see is that Paul obviously sees that these 3 are automatically practiced, and you see them at work in the church at Thessalonica, right? And of course, we looked at hope in the part 2 of the series. We basically focused on the hope that the Thessalonian church had, and we established that one of the main reasons for them to become a model church is their salvation, their hope in salvation, and the second coming of Jesus Christ. And we will look at the love part of this in the next part of the series when we talk about true fellowship. So in this part today, we are going to look at and focus on the first one, which is faith. Now, if you really look at how Paul, what is Paul's concern about Thessalonian church, right? He the story. The story is that he is driven away from Thessalonica, and then he reaches Athens, and in Athens he gets worried about the church, and then he sends Timothy to find out how the church is doing. So he has got a concern for the church, right? And Paul had an opportunity to teach them personally only for about 3 to 4 weeks, as we saw in part one. We look at Acts, and we will know that he had only 3 to 4 weeks, and so he's naturally concerned. Look, was that enough? Did I do enough? Did I teach them enough for them to hold on to the faith and carry on, and things like that? So his concerns for the Thessalonian church grows, and then he sends Timothy to see if their faith has reduced or to exhort them in their faith. Now, what Paul wanted to know was, how is the Thessalonian church doing? Right? Isn't it? How is the Thessalonian church doing? And so he asked his trusted apprentice to go and check on the church. Now, when I was thinking about this, Paul sent Timothy to check on a church, right? I was thinking, look, if we have to really look at how a church is doing, what would be our yardstick? What's the normal yardstick that we use if we have to find out whether the church is doing well or not? Yeah, exactly, right? We will look at, yesterday I was in another city. Actually, I flew back late last night. I was in another city speaking to a professional group of people of quote unquote mega church. Now, so a Christian brother had invited me, to come and preach, and I knew that I had to preach here today. So, while he was speaking on the phone, actually I had put the phone on speakerphone, so Leslie was listening to it too. As I was speaking, as he was inviting me, he said, "This is today, the date is Saturday," and all that. And before I could say anything, because he probably sensed some hesitation in me, and I was hesitant, right? I had a full day workshop on Friday, and then going to another city, and then doing this session, and then coming back and preaching here was not something. I'm getting older, so it's not something that I thought I could manage. So, so he thought he would seal the deal, and you know what he said? He said, "Look, brother, this is a mega church. It's got about 10,000 people, as members." And Leslie was shaking her head, and then after the call was over, Leslie said, "Look, what does the number of people in the church got to do with your preaching?" Right? I don't have an answer for that. But I'm not blaming that Christian brother. I think he was only trying to convince me that, okay, look, this is a good opportunity. Why don't you come and, come and minister here and things like that. So it's not, I'm not assigning any motive to this brother when he said that, that it's a mega church, 10,000 people and all that stuff. But what I'm bringing out is to highlight how we assess the health of a church. You just think about it. You go into a Christian, gathering, maybe a wedding or maybe some other fellowship or whatever it is, and you meet someone who you don't know. Normally the conversation will end up as, "Hey, brother, where do you worship? Well, sister, where do you worship?" Right? It's a common question that we ask, right? And if you say a name of a church that is big and that is well known, that is traditional, that's a mega church and all that, the conversation ends there and goes on to some other topic. The moment you say about, let us say about our church, which probably not many people have heard about, what do you think the next question would be? Yeah, where, of course, and then comes the defining question: how many people are there? How big is the church? And then it may even go on to say, who is your pastor and all that stuff, right? Of course, if we say that, look, we are a small church with 5 people and all that, they will of course try to comfort us, saying that, yeah, nothing wrong with it and stuff like that. But question is always asked: how big is your church? How big is the church? Right? And it is the same thing with, for example, let's say that, that you meet somebody who have left BVF and, who've gone somewhere else, and you meet them after some time, and the conversation comes to this thing. They would automatically, how's the church doing? Has it grown? How many new families have joined? Do you have a pastor now? Right? So basically, these are the ways in which The church is assessed, right? The church is assessed by the world, the numbers, the building, the fame that we can have and things like that. But look at Paul. Look at Paul. What was his concern? His concern, he doesn't mention the numbers even once in all his numbers. He doesn't mention how many new believers have joined you. He doesn't mention who is the leader of the church. What does he talk about? Only one thing. He talks about only one thing. I am concerned about your faith. I am concerned about your faith. You know? Concerned about your faith. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 to 5, please. 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 to 5. What's his concern? Faith, faith, faith. Have you, has your faith, have you, lost your faith? That is my concern. How is your faith growing? How is your faith? Is it strong enough, right? So he actually continues to, he uses this term twice, when I could endure it no longer. I am worried about you and I could endure it no longer. And what am I worried about? I'm worried about what has happened to your faith. What has happened to your faith, right? And so, so he says, I sent Timothy to know about your faith, lest some means the tempter had tempted you and our labor might be in vain, right? So we have sown the seed, we have put in effort, but we don't know whether you've fallen away from the faith and and then started going back. And we know the situation in Thessalonica, right? We saw that it's a pagan place, it's a place of idol worship, it's a place close to the Mount the Mount Olympus, where it is the abode of all the gods, especially the goddess Aphrodite, right? Who is the goddess of erotica and all that stuff. So so basically, there are so many other attractions for you, and I've been there only with you for 3 weeks. And was it enough to to make your faith strong? So his concern was not about the numbers. He never even once asked how many new members joined you, or or whether the congregation has grown, and whether you have a new leader or you have a big building. Where are you meeting now, etc., etc., etc. Or do you have a great pastor now? His concern was just the faith. And he sent Timothy to do one thing, to strengthen his faith, to strengthen his faith. Right? And that is true ministry. When the leaders are not really concerned about the numbers, but the spiritual growth of the congregation, right? The spiritual growth of the congregation, about the faith of the congregation. And you will actually see the other side. When Timothy brings in the report, Paul is comforted, right? Can we read 1 Thessalonians 3, 6 to 8, the next 3 verses, next 4 verses, 6 to 8? Actually, some of the translations says, the New King NKJV says, for now we live if you stand fast in the Lord. So it's like Paul getting a new life, and Paul getting a new life because he says that, look, I've got news that you have not fallen in your faith. Your faith is not weakened, but on the other hand, your faith has only grown, right? So they have. So he says, he says, Timothy has come to us from you and brought the good news of your faith and love, and that you have always good remembrance of us and things like that, right? And so he is basically comforted, and as he says, look, it gives me life. Gives me life, right? So he basically, he gets a new lease of life, looking at what has happened to to his baby, in a way, right? Verse 8, beautiful, right? We live because you stand fast in the Lord, right? And again, in 2 Thessalonians 1:3, you go to 2 Thessalonians 1:3, 2 Thessalonians 1:3. Paul says, we are bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is fitting, because your faith grows exceedingly, and the love of everyone you all abounds towards each other. Faith and love, right? Your faith is growing. And because your faith is growing, I am bound to give thanks to the Lord. I have an obligation to give thanks to the Lord, right? Because your faith is growing, right? Again, the focus is completely on faith, right? And this is true ministry, right? When you're able to strengthen the faith of the congregation, when the congregation grows in faith, but this does not happen by accident, isn't it? A congregation growing in faith does not happen by accident. So again, looking at Thessalonians, we can see that it requires the leaders to do a minimum of a few things, right? The first thing that the leaders need to do to build this thing is this, is basically what you call in Thessalonians 2, in 1 Thessalonians 2, 11 to 12, right? 1 Thessalonians 2, 11 to 12. So there are three things that come out, as you can see on the slide, right? Three things. That is what Paul says. We have exhorted you, we have comforted you, and we have charged you, as a father would do, with, of course, the purpose that you will walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory, right? Exhortation, comforting, and charging. Now, these are the three elements of what I call as the bold preaching and teaching. Bold preaching and teaching, right? Now, the fact is that all of us go through difficulties, all of us have got troubles, trials, and all that stuff. And we wait for a Sunday. We wait for a Sunday so that we can come to church and be comforted with the message that comes to us, isn't it? We want to be comforted with the promises of God. We want to be comforted and reminded that God is sovereign. We want to be comforted and to know that yes, God is a healer. He is a provider. Absolutely, right. And so what happens is, there is always this pressure that, look, since the congregation is looking for a comforting message, the preachers can easily go on that route alone and focus only on the comfort that the Lord provides. But that's not bold preaching. Right? That's only one part of the preaching. So we, in a way, we don't necessarily want to hear about exhortations and then our duties and all that stuff. We want to hear that God is good, he will do good things for us, and stuff like that, right? So the hard fact is that that there are times when we cannot focus only on comforting, and we cannot seek just comfort from the pulpit. We got to, of course, if you are looking for only numerical growth, that will work. Preach only on comfort, numerical growth will come. That's the basis of prosperity gospel. If you look at what does prosperity gospel offer, you come here, all your problems are solved. Right? It's basically preaching about the comfort part of the preaching alone. Right? And but bold preaching requires us to convey the good news and the bad news, or at least the responsibilities that we have. Right? If you look at Paul does this because Paul looks at commending the congregation for their faith, but at the same time he highlights the perils of not accepting the gospel. Right? So you have to give both the sides. Right? There is faith, and there is good things that can come when you do this thing. But if you don't accept the gospel, there is there is a consequence, and it is the preacher's responsibility to bring that out too. Paul comforts them with the hope that comes from the correct understanding of the second coming of Jesus, but exhorts them by preparing them to be holy, stay away from sin, and be holy, and things like that. So the call to holiness, the call to shun sin, these are not things that normally are appreciated by the congregation, right? We don't want to hear about them, not as much as we want to hear about the comforting words that come from the Bible, right? Paul, so it's basically, but it has to be there. Now, Paul affirms the fact that the Lord is faithful and will guard us, right? He will guard us. But Paul wants them that, look, don't go by rumors and false teachings. Don't go and, look at only one side of it. Don't go for that's in 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 to 15. And of course, he makes his views clear on issue of the, so this false teachings is in 2 Thessalonians 2, 2. And the passage in 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 to 15. It is all about idleness, right? Idleness and how we should not be idle, right? And he goes to the extent of saying that, look, you stay away from brothers who are idle. You stay away from brothers who are idle, right? So that's what he says. So he makes his views very clear about idleness, and he says, look, don't even fellowship with people who are idle. And of course, he goes on to say that people who are idle should not even eat. Paul says, I'm gentle like a nursing mother, right? Probably the most intimate image that can be have of gentleness, right? Of a nursing mother. So he says, I have been gentle with you as a nursing mother. But he also says, I have to charge you as a father. Right? So the balancing of the parenthood, right? Be gentle, but at the same time, charge them. Right? Charge them, exhort, tell them what is their responsibility, what they should do, what they should not do, and things like that. Right? So true ministry of the word has to balance between exhortation, comfort, and charging. Right? It cannot be one-sided. Cannot be one-sided. And as a congregation, it would actually be unfair on our part to expect only comforting messages to come from the pulpit. I mean, typically, why do preachers fall on by default on the comfort preaching? Because they know that is the congregation will love it, and that's what they're looking for, right? And we may lose some of the congregation members if we start talking about sin and hell and the responsibilities that we have as Christians, right? But that is not bold preaching. What makes faith strong is bold preaching. So so that's something that we need to look at. So that's the first one. Bold preaching, is the first one that one should expect if we have to look at strengthening the faith in the ministry. The second one is what we call as setting examples, whether the leaders set examples, right? I'm talking about, of course, not just the pastor, but everyone in our setup. It is primarily everyone who is an example to each other, right? True ministry happens when when they exhibit those behaviors, and Paul did that. Paul exemplified bold preaching, as we already saw that in 2:2 and then 2:4, right? And in part 3, last time when we also looked at Paul setting a personal example of when we should share the gospel. You remember that? So he flipped that, walk the talk into talk your walk. He flipped the, practice what you preach into preach what you practice, right? So he says, set an example first. And in the cycle of true transformation, if you remember, this true transformation is a cycle of hearing and accepting the word, and then imitating Christ, being an example, and then last comes sharing the gospel with others, right? And Paul exhibited that. He says, look, we were an example to you. We were an examples to you, right? So that's what he does, right? So you would see that in this, right? And look at the history. Where did Paul? I mean, where was Paul before he was in Thessalonica? Before he started his journey to Thessalonica, if you remember the Acts series, he was in Philippi. And what happened in Philippi? He got jailed, right? He got jailed. He was put in prison, and then of course through some miraculous happenings and things like that, he escaped and went out. Now you've gone through difficulties. You've been you've been beaten. You've been put in stocks or whatever it is, and you've been put in prison, and you get released. And normally, what would we do as a normal human being? If it is me, I would basically look for another safe place to go and spend a vacation and rejuvenate myself, recharge myself, and all that. But what does Paul do? He goes to Thessalonica, which is again another pagan place where he knows there's not even a single Christian there, and he knows that he's going to face persecution. He's going to again have problems, but he boldly walks into what we could call as the lion's den. That is exemplification of bold preaching. Right? Preach the gospel despite persecution and threats and suffering. He knew that he was going to be. He was persecuted. And he gets up from that persecution and goes to another place knowing that he's going to be persecuted again. That's a great example of bold preaching. Right? And again, it is my point of view, but my point of view is that the world is designed to resist the gospel. And let me explain what I mean by this. I don't know how many of you do exercise, right? If you do exercise, you would have heard about something called the resistance band. Have you heard about resistance bands? Right? Now, resistance bands are used for what? For strengthening your muscles, for strengthening your core and stuff like that, right? To advertise ourselves, Leslie and I use it once in a while, not always, but so it is. Why is it called resistance band? Because it offers resistance. And what does that resistance do? That resistance builds strength, isn't it? That resistance builds strength. Right? I'm a great fan of biking, right? And one of my bucket lists is to ride a Harley Davidson all the way to Palakkad and come back. But unfortunately, Leslie says she was never going to come with me on that trip. So anyway, I have to see when that bucket list will happen. But I love Harley Davidson bikes, right? Anyway, any bike, but specifically Harley Davidson. This bike weighs almost about 300 kilos. On an average weight of a Harley Davidson bike is about 300 kilos. And it's got about 7 gears and all that stuff. Now, what do the gears do? The gears provide resistance. Right? When you initially start, you're in first gear, and that is the highest resistance because you got to move this 300 plus, another 80 kilos or 80 or 100 kilos of two people sitting. So almost about 400 kilos, you have to make it move. And what does make it move? It is the resistance that the gear provides that gives it that knock to move. And then it is the resistance that makes it move faster and faster, gains momentum, and makes it steady, keeps it steady. Harley Davidson is known as a cruise bike. Even if the road is rough, it will sail smoothly. What provides that smooth sailing, the momentum, and everything? It is the resistance that the bike and the gears provide. So what's our learning from this? Resistance is designed to strengthen. Without resistance, the strength is over. Right? So I think so. That's where I believe that resistance to gospel will only make the gospel stronger. Right? Resistance to gospel will only make the gospel stronger, not weaker at all. Right? So yeah. So ultimately, of course, there could be, governments could bring in laws to prevent the good news being, shared. They can bring in laws to prevent priests from wearing their cassocks, or some of the states where now this is happening, right? People are banning, saying that priests cannot wear cassocks while they are in school and other places. There should be no religious symbols in schools. It should be all restricted to churches alone and all that. So government can bring in laws about all of them. But let us remember, resistance makes us stronger. Same way, resistance to gospel will make it strong. And not just in our country. It is, of course, across the world. Right? It's across the world. And then Paul actually sets that example of preaching boldly, despite resistance, despite persecution, threats, and even threat to his life sometimes. Right? So that's the first one. The second one is where Paul, as a preacher, sets his example is in hard work and diligence. Right? If you look at 1 Thessalonians 2:9 and 2 Thessalonians 3:7-9, he is explaining how he tried his best to not to be a burden to the congregation. He didn't take anything from the congregation. He was saying that, look, I worked hard so that I can provide for my living, so that I don't need to burden you for anything. I don't need to burden you for anything. The true example, okay, of hard work and diligence, so that you don't become a burden, not to the society, but definitely not to the congregation that you are preaching to. Right. So that's the second example that Paul sets. The third one, of course, is very evident: thanksgiving and prayer. Right? Thanksgiving and prayer. So we saw two things. One is bold preaching, second is example, and the third one is true ministry is founded in prayer and thanksgiving. I think Pastor Augustine continues to talk to us about this, continues to exhort us. Pray, please, pray, pray. I think the number of sermons he would have provided on prayer is amazing, right? And then here Paul, he obviously, he starts this letter. He starts the letter by thanking God for the Thessalonians and praying for the Thessalonians. You can see that in 1 Thessalonians 1:2, 1 Thessalonians 3:10, 2 Thessalonians 1:11, and stuff like that. He continues to pray for them in all of them. So his prayers for the Thessalonians is evident, right? And again, after he prays, it's interesting that he doesn't start with asking others to pray. He sets an example of praying and then says in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, what does 1 Thessalonians 5:17 say? One of the most, yes, exactly, right? Pray without ceasing. Before he does that, he is doing it himself. He is doing it himself. And then he says, brothers and sisters, pray without ceasing. And then he does another thing. Don't just pray for us. Pray for the ministers. We need your prayers for me and the team and the ministry team, right? And so that's the third thing that we are looking at. So, and again, importance of prayer is very, very evident in the letters to Thessalonians. So let's take an example of the Thessalonian church and become a praying church, if we might. Reset our expectations that we will hear only comforting messages from the pulpit. Let's be open to hearing exhorting messages or charging messages, reminding us of our responsibility, reminding us of holiness, and let us start setting examples, and let us be a prayerful church. So that's some of the things that we could learn from on this part, right? How do we look at true ministry, right? So if we summarize this, I think we can see that we saw that true ministry is the second pillar of the church, true church, and true ministry happens when faith, hope, and love are strengthened in the congregation. All the three of them. Of course, in this part we just looked at the faith part alone, and how do we strengthen that? And we saw that faith is the true measure. Faith is the true measure of a true church. Not numbers, not the building size, right? Not the popularity of the pastor, etc. Faith. How strong are we in faith? And we saw that strengthening of the faith requires three things. That is, one is bold and fearless preaching from the pulpit, not just comforting messages. Second is leaders setting personal examples before they preach. And the third is, of course, prayer and thanksgiving. So let's remember this as we look at how we can prepare ourselves for the second coming of Jesus Christ, following the example that Paul asked the Thessalonian church to do.